Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? Uh, is it okay to start? Okay, then maybe I'll start. All right. So, good morning, everyone. So sorry that I won't be able to be there today. It would have been nice to be able to see everyone and meet everyone. But nonetheless, right? Thank you for attending my session. So my name is Juan Senga. I'm a PhD student from NBS NTU here in Singapore, and today I'll be presenting a project together with my supervisor Jeffrey Chua, and it's entitled Ethically Complex Blood Supply Interventions During Pandemics. So, the thing is, right, during the time when we submitted this project a couple of weeks ago, we actually have an updated paper entitled A Simulation Model for Blood Supply During Disasters and Pandemics. But nonetheless, to stay true to the abstract, I'll be focusing on this part of the paper, which in the updated version is a case study that's subsumed in this version, right? Well, nonetheless, right, we'll still be presenting some of the models and formulations that we used in this paper to discuss the results. So let's begin. um, so if we look at it, right, so a blood bank's core problem is really being able to match supply and demand in both an efficient and ethical way. So efficiency is pretty straightforward in a sense that there have been a lot of scholars who have studied it extensively throughout the years. We have here a typical blood supply chain in a blood bank. So you have donors who give blood to blood banks. This blood gets transferred to hospitals, and the hospitals transfuse them to patients. The thing is, though, blood banks tend to be quite complex in a sense that number one, you have perishability of your blood products. So it depends on the blood component, like what the outdate time is or the lifetime is. But for example, for RBCs, it's going to be 5 to 6 weeks. You also have donor regeneration. So Professor Jeffrey and myself have also been working on this, which is essentially when donors donate, they have around 8 to 12 weeks before they can donate again sometime in the future. And the third sort of complicating factor of blood supply chains would be stochasticity from both the demand from both the demand as well as the supply side. So like I mentioned, this has been studied extensively. So we can look at the literature review by Belien and Force in 2012 and Paraban et al. In 2019 and see all of the advancements in blood supply management. But the thing is, right, there's also another aspect of blood supply management that deals with the ethical management of it. So over the years, you have various organizations and conventions that have come together to decide on what should be the guiding principles towards how we manage blood donation. And this sort of culminated in 2009 in the Melbourne Declaration, wherein the World Health Organization said that, okay, now our focus should be 100% voluntary, non remunerated donation. So, what's so called VNRBD. What this means is that donors should not be coerced or forced or even paid to give blood, right? And that's sort of the guiding principle that countries utilize now. Okay. But the thing is, when you have all of these conventions and all of these declarations, they only considered blood donation from the perspective of peacetime, right? So, meaning there are no disasters, no pandemics, no disruptions. But if we look at the situation that we have globally over the past couple of years, there have been a variety of disasters, and more recently, right? Actually, up until the present, there's the COVID-19 pandemic. So, if you look at, let's say, these five examples, there usually isn't any problem when it comes to asking people for blood or blood donations. Whenever blood banks send out calls to these people, the people usually respond with donations, of an outpouring of donations to the point that the blood banks would need to turn them away. But there's something peculiar that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, wherein there are certain countries wherein even though the blood banks decided to invite people to donate, these people didn't go and donate blood, right? And primarily it was because of two things: lockdown measures and basically the fear of people going to places that's associated to hospitals or healthcare, right? So they're afraid that they might get the virus in those areas. So we thought of this and said that okay, we can put a name to that behavior and say that it's called, the propensity to donate of a population. And there's sort of two types that come into mind, which is altruism as well as hesitation. On in altruism, that's basically what we usually see um, in typical disasters, right? Blood banks ask for blood and people donate. But there's also hesitation in that, like I said, whenever, even though blood banks would ask for blood, the people wouldn't respond with donations. So, with that in mind, there is a, should I say, a problem or an ethical dilemma that blood banks are now looking at. Okay, so if people are not responding to my usual calls for blood, and I've tried everything I can to actually ask them to donate, should then ethically complex interventions be utilized in order to gain blood? Because in the first place, if I can't, like, if I don't allow myself to help other people, it's also an ethical dilemma. So there's like an ethical, there's a blurred ethical line that you're trying to navigate here. So in this project, we're looking at five ethically complex interventions. So it's reducing regeneration time, meaning you allow donors to donate more frequently, which subjects them to possible harm. You reduce transfusion quantities, meaning you ration blood to patients, or ration limited blood to patients, which subjects patients to possible harm. You defer demand, which is the usual ethically complex intervention that's being utilized by countries now, wherein you reschedule elective surgeries later on. But the problem is that this can be aggravated if you postpone it for a long time. You can also tap non-traditional donors, so those who have been restricted in the past, right? So those who are a bit older, those who have tattoos, those who are part of the group MSM, right? So that's also an intervention. And lastly is paid donation. So this is what the Melbourne Declaration says is not really is the basis for not having that focus towards voluntary blood donation. So um, so let me focus on what we're going to be trying to look at in this research, right, or in this case study rather. Um, the first question is, well, what effect does the pandemic have on the supply of blood in blood banks of varying maturity levels? And I'll explain this more later on. The second is, right, how does propensity to donate during a pandemic change its effect on blood supply? And lastly, which of the ethically complex interventions I mentioned are effective during pandemics, and how does this change with maturity? So, to do this, we utilized discrete event simulation, or DES, with underlying principles from inventory theory. And we wanted to do this because we realized that blood banks are complex, and all of the features present in blood banks should be incorporated in our DES model. So inventory theory and blood banking has not been a stranger to DES. So it's actually a heavily used tool. So we believe that, this is an appropriate tool to analyze these questions. All right. I'll go straight into the model just to give everyone a brief understanding of it. Uh, in order for us to analyze the effect of pandemics or to model pandemics, we had to divide our planning horizon into distinct phases. We call them the pre-pandemic, the pandemic, and the post-pandemic phase. So further, our pandemic phase is divided into three segments: the ramp up, the plateau, and decline phases. If you look at this graph here, this sample graph here, it shows us that in the simulation model, the user can actually increase the number of waves of a pandemic. And that's just perfect for us, right? Because we wanted to see what the effect of a pandemic is to a blood bank along with the ethically complex interventions. Uh, our model has, sorry, so this should be two donor types. So let me correct that. There's two initial donor types. We have regular and eligible donors. Our blood is perishable with a lifetime of M. we have donors who are regenerating over a time period of K, and we have a donor deferral level Li. So this donor deferral level is a typical uh, process that blood banks have, wherein if they have enough inventory in their system and a donor arrives to donate, the blood bank can ask these donors to come back at a later time, right? Just so their blood won't be wasted. We also have stochastic demand and supply. So I note here that our demand is assumed to be Poisson with mean mu s, so it's time dependent. But in reality, right, the user can change the distribution of the demand as well as the supply, so which we assume to be binomial. So that's sort of what we were trying to get at when we created the larger paper, wherein the demand and supply processes are user inputs that can be dependent or data or just inputs based on a particular distribution. So what we wanted to model in this paper is when you move from phase to phase, you also have a change in your demand as well as donation rates, and that's sort of mediated by this gamma parameter as well as the lambda parameter. So this lambda parameter is actually the what captures propensity to donate. So whether people would increase or decrease their donations during pandemics. So with this, we also need to be able to include all of the ethically complex interventions. And for us to model that, we just have to introduce different parameters for each of the ethically complex interventions. So these are the parameters raw. So each one for each of the ethically complex interventions. So for example, we have raw K, which affects regeneration time. So in this way, we have raw D, which is for rationing of blood, which affects stochastic demand and supply. We also have raw NT for non-traditional donor pools, which changes our donor pool formulation. We have deferral of demand, which again affects stochastic demand and supply. And lastly, we have paid donation, which affects like multiple areas of our model. So one thing to note about paid donation is that it also affects the donation rates of your other types of donors. And that's because of what's called the crowding out effect, wherein those who are previously altruistic would reduce their donation rates in the presence of paid donors. So I won't be discussing like all of the details of the transitions of the model, and I am just going to give everyone an example here because each phase has its own transition equations. But what's important to note is that because we're using discrete event simulation, there are no actual choices that are being made throughout the planning horizon. The choices are made prior to starting the simulation. For example, what the deferral level is, or what intervention and what level of intervention you're going to use, right? So primarily, this is like an evaluation and analysis tool that blood banks and policymakers can use in order to assess the effect of different interventions, ethically complex or otherwise. So going to that example or going to coming from that notion, right, I'm gonna go ahead and sort of give a brief understanding of how the simulation model can be used. So in our larger, like more updated paper, the simulation model can be used to analyze, for example, the effect of changing the deferral level and seeing what the resulting inventory, fill rate, donor deferral, and outdates will be. We can change and look at what the effect of propensity to donate is, as well as varying the issuing policy. So usually in blood banking, there's uh, an understanding that's going to be first in, first out. But then our model allows us to change this to last in, first out, or even anything in between, right? So an age-based threshold policy that's mediated by the parameter age. So uh, let me go to how we analyze ethically complex interventions. So the way we did this was we didn't really have transactional data, so we had to make do with proxy data, open source proxy data. So we obtained it from three sets. The first is from the World Health Organization's Global Status Report on Blood Safety. Second is the World Bank's population data set. And the third is Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 dataset. So since we wanted to look at, the effect of pandemics and the different lengths of pandemics, this was a problem because during the time we gathered the data, the pandemic wasn't finished for a number of countries. So in order to address this, right? So you can see here that we didn't have any two waves. Some of them didn't really finish their first wave yet, or we don't know when the peak will be, right? So to address this, what we did was we actually estimated the lengths as well as the change in demand, so the gamma values, um, for each of the countries which have missing parameters to it. So we used regression to do that. And we gathered data by dividing all of the countries into two distinct sets. Sorry, two distinct sets. Oh, so those were sorry, those were oh sorry, let me I think I'm having some sorry about that. So we divided our data into two distinct sets. Those where you have the family replacement rate being less than 10% and the family replacement rate being greater than 10%. So this family replacement rate allows us to determine or distinguish between um, blood banks who are mature and maturing. So those who are developed and not yet developed. So if you're a maturing blood bank, it means that your family replacement rate is greater than 10. And if you're a mature blood bank, it means that your family replacement rate is less than 10. So just so to be able to show you the results, I'll skip this. So we performed our simulation and we looked at fill rate as our main performance measure. So this is our results for this case study. So this is the fill rate for those maturing blood banks with low propensity to donate, meaning donors drop off their donation rates during pandemics. So I'll guide you through understanding this, but the main idea is okay, if I'm a maturing blood bank, our simulation and our results say that during the pre-pandemic phase, you already have very low fill rate, meaning you're already not able to fulfill blood demand requirements. And this is aggravated further during the first pandemic phase and more so during the second pandemic phase, which just goes to show how detrimental it is to have multiple pandemic waves for a maturing blood bank. Interestingly, if you look at the reducing regeneration intervention, it doesn't really do anything in terms of increasing your fill rate. And this is interesting because the World Health Organization released a document during the start of 2020 saying that specifically for COVID-19, if blood banks would want to increase their blood supply, they should reduce regeneration. But we can see from our simulation that this isn't the case. And the reason for that is because this would only be effective if the donors would immediately donate once they are available. So if it's not guaranteed, then the reducing regeneration intervention will not be as effective. Uh, Deferring demand, right, is also interesting because even though it increases fill rate during the pandemic, it actually decreases fill rate after the pandemic. And this is also alluded to by researchers and surgeons when they said that um, when we do this intervention, there's going to be at least a 1 to 2 year like time frame wherein we need to clear the backlogs for all of the surgeries that were deferred. Lastly, for maturing blood banks, we can see that using paid donation would increase the fill rate both during and after the pandemics, right? So conversely, if we look at the mature blood banks, uh, the fill rate during the pre-pandemic phase is already very high, so but that's expected. But what is but what's worthy to point out here is that during the second pandemic phase, right? the fill rate of these blood banks is going to drop significantly. So again, alluding to how detrimental it is to have longer pandemics which have multiple waves. What I would want to point out here is that if you're a mature blood bank, the paid donation intervention actually reduces your fill rate, right? So, in comparison to maturing blood banks, wherein your fill rate increases, for mature blood banks, your fill rate decreases, right? Owing to the phenomenon of um, crowding out of voluntary donors. So these are also the results for the other scenarios, but generally the insights are the same.
Well,
So I w-
we have
sorry,
another 10 minutes. Sorry, we have another 10 minutes for you.
sorry, what's that?
We have another 10 minutes for you. Let's wrap up quickly.
Okay, okay, sure. So this is my last slide actually. So I guess like in order to summarize our results, we wanted to put it in a table, right? So in both mature and maturing blood banks, as well as in the specific phases or the important phases, the pandemic and post-pandemic phases. And we would want to highlight in all of this that the purpose of our research isn't really to invite blood banks to use ethically complex interventions. Rather, what we want to say is that whenever these blood banks would now have a problem in satisfying demand during disasters or pandemics, these are options that they can consider, but must they must be aware of the consequences if they use it even after the pandemic. So, in the case of maturing blood banks, they should be wary in using paid donation because they might lose out on the process of becoming mature later on, right? So, uh, sorry for running over time, but that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Any question from online audience? Any question from on-site audience?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So have you checked sensitivity of your results to all these parameters that you have estimated?
Yeah, so actually so the results that I've presented here are only for a specific set of parameters, but we did check. So I wasn't able to discuss this further, but we actually checked the parameters, the results for different sets of parameters, and generally the results are the same. It's just, I guess, the magnitude of the results that would differ, but the general direction is the same.
小波。
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I'm not sure whether I understand the model correctly. So it seems that the donor arrival is I mean, the donor arrival is extraordinary given, right? So I think, but in reality, the donor might have the self-selection process. They might want to decide when to come and I mean, whether to come and when to come. So is this considered in the model?
So right now, that's not considered in the model. So we just assume that the donor arrivals is stochastic based on a user-defined distribution. So in this case, we assume that the donor arrival follows a binomial distribution. But that is interesting because uh, I guess we have we thought that the stochastic arrival of the donors would already sort of model that decision making process of the donors of when to arrive, right? And we just wanted to capture some form of stochastic process.
I see. Thanks.
Any more questions?
You mentioned you use some proxy data, right? I'm not sure whether I missed that in the presentation, but were you able to like see any difference among different countries, like in terms of the response?
So when we talk about proxy data, uh, we don't have actual data from how the countries responded in terms of their blood donation during COVID-19, right? So what we did though was we tried to tie um, how every country, we tried to see what the demand change will be in every country, and then we simulated what the resulting fill rate will be at varying levels of response of a country, right? So if you think about it, we have COVID-19 data, right? We have the donation rates from the countries, the normal donation rates outside of a pandemic, but then our model allows us to see how these donors are going to react at different levels of propensity to donate. So if it's a positive propensity to donate or a negative propensity to donate, right? And that's where we got our insights and our analysis by saying like, okay, a country's parameters, what happens to the fill rate if the propensity to donate changes at different levels?
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We still have time for one more question.
Excuse me?
All right.
Yeah, okay. Actually, I have one problem about in lockdown period, even though you have this intervention, but you are not allowed to go blood bank to have donations. So I think it could affect your intervention, something.
So our assumption here is that when the blood banks implement these interventions, right? So there's actually like the assumption is that when blood banks try to implement these interventions, they've
Mhm.
actually already tried all of the other interventions, right? Meaning those wherein they would have the capability to uh, ferry people from their homes to the blood bank. So in that case, like when people don't want to go out and give blood, that's when these types of interventions would uh, merit some thought, right? So what we're saying is these are the interventions that might actually induce donors to donate blood given their fear of going out, right? Precisely because of propensity to donate.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So you mean there's intervention will let people willing to go the blood bank
Yes,
to
correct. So
okay.
so so what I want to highlight there is actually um, the non-traditional donors and the paid donors are the ones who we are sort of saying would be more willing to go out and give blood, because the
Mhm,
other intervention sort of affects another aspect. It's like you're managing demand and supply, right? So for example,
mhm,
deferring demand. If people don't want to go to the blood bank to donate, then what you can do is to just postpone some of the demand to a later period so that
mhm,
you would have higher fill rates now. But indeed, the
mhm.
effect of that is you will have lower fill rates after the pandemic or the disaster, which would be detrimental as well.
Okay. Thank you so
Right.
much.
Right. No problem. Thank you for the question.
Sorry, Prof. Teo still have one question.
Can I just ask maybe a stupid questions? So my question is on the robustness of all your findings. So
Okay.
I just wonder whether the phenomenon that you saw from the simulation, is it a fixture of your assumption or the parameters that you have chosen in the simulation model?
Yeah. So Prof, right? Um, we recognize that a lot of the results here would be actually parameter dependent, right? And that's why we sort of opted to go through various parameters in the simulation process. But at the same time, that's also the reason why we wanted to put this sort of as a subsumed case study under a more general like paper or tool, which the purpose of which is for blood banks to use to assess some of their interventions or policy, right? And that's sort of the direction that we want to go to. But yes, I agree completely, right? The results here, of course, like they're going to be parameter dependent, but uh, our answer to that is we're gonna try to simulate as many parameters as possible to cover, high and low values of the parameter, as well as different like the different values of every country.
Okay, let's thank Juan again for his interesting presentation.
All right, thank you very much.